Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 247. This is for class for Thursday, the 30th, where I wanted to talk a little bit more about the role of female in the 1800s and beyond. Last class, as you know, we discussed the cult of true womanhood. I also wanted to discuss paper number one. And not that paper number one is going to be due anytime soon, but I did want you to begin thinking about possibilities for paper number one, particularly because this is a condensed summer session. And then finally to begin Frankenstein, our first major literary work of the semester. Though last class we had talked about K. Chopin's The Story of an Hour, just to give us a bit of a sense of female voice during the time period. So, in terms of the notes below, you can see that I've begun by talking about a booklet that I find quite fascinating. It's called Is College Bad for Girls? I actually found this booklet in an antique store, and the original is hanging in my office. It is a 1906 medical pamphlet arguing that college is bad for girls. And it gives you an idea of some of the threats of not only reading, but education as a whole. So I encourage you to click on the link so that you can see the visual where you have a picture of a female, supposed to be rather risque because her breast is showing and she's smoking. And some of the points discussed in the booklet: the evils of dormitory life, midnight hours of who knows what, or flirting and speaking to the male without proper introductions and chaperones, or reading improper novels, magazines, and other suggestive literatures, or forming of unladylike habits that may harm the health and morals of a delicate girl, such as smoking and card playing. So I continue on with a text that came out in 1887, but in 1987, there is a foreword that I wanted to draw your attention to. It's called The American Girl's Handybook, and it was supposed to be a kind of craft book for females for the time period. And I was able to find the link for that for both the book as well as for the foreword, and it was the foreword itself that I wanted to focus on. The idea of how they presented what life would have been like for female. And the foreword begins: if girls in Victorian America were confused, who can blame them? From every quarter they heard conflicting voices, each confidently articulating its own version of what girls needed. And some of the things that we're told is that the female body, with its limited available energy, could not successfully meet the physical demands of puberty, while also enduring the mental strain of study, or so it was purported at the time, citing cases from, of all places, Vassar College, scientific evidence to show, and I put scientific evidence in quotation marks, to show that too much study, and certainly any attempt to match male educational achievements, would sap the developing female organs, leaving girls weak, nervous, and sterile. A frightening prospect, and now I'm reading word for what girl wanted to end up like 18-year-old Miss D, who emerged from 4 years at Vassar, a hysterical invalid, her breasts and reproductive organs withered from excessive study and physical exercise. And the introduction continues. It says that if girls were anemic and subject to fashionable fits of fainting or afflicted with anorexic-like diseases, the reformers argued that what they needed was plenty of outdoor exercise, protein-rich diets, and new clothing styles. That was my cuckoo clock, my apologies. And new clothing styles to emphasize function over fashion, which was one of the reasons why the American Girl's Handybook was created. And the American girl would be viewed as someone between the ages of 8 and 18 who is healthy and spirited, something that would be very much in contrast to the way that um, the ideal female and the ideal girl would be presented in the 1800s. And that this girl would be someone who loves nature, is healthy, also is handy. Now, the authors of this book, Linda and Adelia Beard, they helped form the Campfire Girls. And there was also another publication at the time, the American Boys Handybook, and it talks about some of the stereotypes and assumptions of the time in terms of what it meant to be a boy. And even in this introduction in the American Girls Handybook, we're told that boys are wild and uncivilized, something that you would see in, for instance, Huckleberry Finn. Um, and I reference this again just to give you an idea of how the world would have been viewed at the time period to prepare us for some of the texts that really question this ideal. Darwin's Origin of Species, and I'm probably not incorrect in thinking that most of you have heard, if not read, Darwin's Origin of Species. They came out in 1859. That talked a bit about female inferiority because of the ability to reproduce. And the link that I've included for you is from Smithsonian Magazine. And this link talks a little bit about the way that Darwin's theories were questioned. And the sense of the female being tied to reproductive elements was something that was questioned in the 1800s. In fact, this article written by Antoinette Blackwell in 1869, that our Smithsonian Magazine article references, talks about how the author questioned Darwin's theory that, quote, evolution made man superior to woman. For Darwin, that superiority largely played out in the intellectual and artistic realm. He wrote, if two lists were made of the most eminent men and women in poetry, painting, sculpture, music, comprising composition and performance, history, science, and philosophy, the two lists would not bear comparison. And the the Smithsonian Magazine article also references social scientist of the time, Herbert Spencer, who echoed Darwin's sentiments and went further, postulating that in order for the human race to flourish, women must devote their lives to reproduction. And I suspect that none of these attitudes are particularly surprising, considering what we've read in The Cult of True Womanhood. Another link that I wanted to draw your attention to is a teacher's contract. This from 1923. So just 100 years ago or so, this would have been the kind of contract that a teacher would have been required to sign. And you could see that there were great restrictions that were placed on a teacher. First and foremost, she needed to be unmarried. Keep that in mind when we read something like Jane Eyre. And that ultimately she should shy away from anything that could be considered seductive or sensual, and that she should be under the care and presence of a male, and she should avoid places where corruption could occur, such as ice cream parlors. So I like to joke in the summertime that that's where I'm going to be spending my time, in an ice cream parlor. The 1950s. So notice that we're getting closer and closer to our time period. The link that I've included is something called the Good Wives Guide. Now, there's some dispute as to whether or not this literally appeared in a periodical, but I think you can understand the sentiment, even if this is not necessarily accurate to something that would have appeared in a periodical. And a good wife would have dinner ready and plan ahead even the night before for her husband. A good wife would prepare herself, taking 15 minutes or so to rest, to be refreshed when the husband arrives. A good wife would be a little gay and interesting for her husband. A good wife would clear away clutter. A good wife would prepare and light a fire during the cooler months for her husband to unwind by, so that the husband feels he's reached a haven of rest and order. A good wife would minimize all noise. At the time of the husband's arrival, eliminate noises of appliances and encourage the children to be quiet. A good wife would always be happy to see her husband and greet him with a warm smile and show sincerity in her desire to please him. A good wife would listen to her husband, and while she might have a dozen important things to say, the moment of the husband's arrival would not be the appropriate time. Let the husband talk first, remembering that his topics of conversation are more important than her topics. Never greet the husband with complaints or problems, and don't complain if the husband is late for dinner or even if he stays out all night. Count this as minor compared to what he might have gone through at work. Make the husband comfortable. Have him lean back in a comfortable chair, or lie him down in the bedroom, have a cool or warm drink ready. Arrange the husband's pillow and offer to take off his shoes. Speak in a low, soothing, and pleasant voice. And don't ask the husband questions about his actions or question his judgment or integrity. Remember, he's the master of the house, and as such, will always exercise his will with fairness and truthfulness. You have no right to question him. A good wife always knows her place. And I can continue on with example after example. And obviously what we wanted to do was to read some of the literature of the time period that questioned these ideologies. There are two documentaries that I highly recommend that you aren't required to watch, but I encourage you to watch if you have the time and the inclination. You may have heard of Jean Kilbourne. She's very famous in media studies, and she's done work with the portrayal of female in the media, specifically advertising. She began this work in the 1970s with a documentary entitled Killing Us Softly. And then what she did was she updated her documentary approximately a decade later with Killing Us Softly 2. And then a decade later, Killing Us Softly 3. And then Killing Us Softly 4. Now, this is a documentary that's oftentimes shown in psychology and sociology classes. So you may have familiarity with this, but if not, I encourage you to watch her documentary if you are interested. What she does is she's taken advertising, which is not meant, obviously, to be studied from an academic perspective. It's meant basically to sell product. And she used those advertisements as a way to show how females portrayed in society and talking about what some of the expectations and stereotypes of female are based on those portrayals. And while each of her documentaries show changes over the decades, they also show, rather frighteningly, similarities over the decades. And as you know, we certainly live in a time period right now where the role of female is under great stressors politically and socially. But Killing Us Softly 4, which came out in 2010, or Killing Us Softly Then and Now, which came out in 2019, from the Media Education Foundation. One, Killing Us Softly 4, is 45 minutes long, and you can see that I've got the link below if you decided to watch it. Again, you're not required to. And then Killing Us Softly Then and Now, which is the most recent, as far as I know of, the most recent version of analysis of Killing Us Softly documentaries. That was a speech that was done in 2019. She oftentimes speaks at local colleges such as Smith, the Media Education Foundation, being housed in Northampton. So we've got all of that. And, oh, I skipped something. I'm sorry. 5 things that women couldn't do in the 1960s. And there's a link for you to look at. I've already referenced one, that a woman was not able to take out a credit card independently until the 1970s. So again, you can see as we get closer to our contemporary time periods, obviously there have been advances for the role of female, but there also have been limitations put in place. Which gets me to our paper topic, and you can find this in the syllabus and other documents folder. And what I wanted to do was to have you basically contemplate how the cult of true womanhood is connected to the text that we are going to be reading over the course of the semester. The cult of true womanhood sort of laying the foundation for the historical and sociological expectation for female. And our papers, the first being approximately midway through the semester, the second being at the ending of the semester, both papers are similar in that they're going to be critical papers, or in other words, I'm not going to ask you to use outside resources. Paper length for both of them would be approximately 4 to 5 pages long, but they should be as long as you think you need them to be in order to be able to defend your thesis. And over the course of the semester, we'll talk about some of the conventions for writing a paper. Hopefully that'll be review for you. And the topic that I've indicated is the topic that you can choose to write about, or you can create your own topic. But if you choose to write on your own topic, you should discuss the topic with me ahead of time. And I hope all of you at some point discuss your interests. In terms of quoting from the actual text itself, which you would need to do, that would be your defense. I'm asking you to use the MLA system of parenthetical documentation, MLA being for Modern Language Association, which is the convention for the humanities and certainly for English classes. And again, I'll review this. I hope this is review for you after taking Comp 1 and Comp 2. And basically, you are going to be asked to see the syllabus for paper formatting specifications. Again, fairly straightforward in that with the MLA, what you do is after a quote in parentheses, you indicate the page number of that quote. So my thinking is that page or paper number 1 would address the earlier set of readings in the class. That would be either the story of an hour. The writing about a short story is a bit different than writing about a novel. Obviously, you're going to have to do more careful in textual analysis with something that's only a page and a half rather than 150 pages. Or Frankenstein or Persuasion. So those will be the texts that we're focusing on at the beginning of the semester. And paper number 2 being very similar, but you would be focusing on different texts, the texts that we'll be reading in the second half of the semester. That would be Jane Eyre, or Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, or The Awakening. And in between those 2 sections, we will be doing some of Emily Dickinson's poetry. So Emily Dickinson is also an option, but much like writing about a short story is different than writing about a novel. Certainly writing about a poem is very different than writing about a novel or a short story. So the topic that I selected is an actual quote from The Cult of True Womanhood. That, quote, girls could be ruined by a book which attacked or seemed to attack woman's accepted place in society. So if you were to select this particular topic, you would examine how that quote applies to the text that you've selected for your paper. But regardless of the topic that you choose, whether it be the topic that I've selected for you or a topic that you've chosen on your own that you've had approved by me, you want to provide textual evidence to support your arguments. In other words, quotation and paraphrase from the text. And at the bottom of this, I have a good question to ask yourself when you're writing a paper or reading someone else's writing is, quote, have I, or has the author, said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible? And then you can see that at the ending of that quote, in parentheses, following the quote, I've got the author's last name and the page number, which is the convention for quoting. and then I close my parentheses. I've got my ending punctuation. And again, I'll review this as we get a little bit closer to the paper. Not that I expect you to begin the paper now, but I expect you to begin thinking about the paper now that we're beginning our first major text, and that happens to be Frankenstein, written by Mary Shelley in 1818. And you might be familiar with Mary Shelley. She was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a leading feminist of the time. The story was written as part of a horror competition where Mary Shelley was vacationing with friends and they had some inclement weather. So what they did was they challenged themselves to a ghost story writing competition. What Mary Shelley had happened that evening is she had a nightmare, which was actually the creation scene of the creature in Frankenstein. And she wrote that as her story, and she showed it to her husband, Percy Shelley, the famous romantic poet. He suggested to her that she expand the story, which she did, and the rest is history. It's Frankenstein. And this story, as I talked, I believe, a bit about last class, it straddles a lot of genres. Definitely, it has elements of the Gothic tradition, which we will talk about next class, what that is. And it's a text that we study in my Gothic literature class. Definitely, it straddles elements of science fiction, and we'll talk a little bit about that next class. And of course, it definitely is important in terms of feminist literature, which is what we are going to be focusing on. And this idea that Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley's husband, suggested changes and edits has even led to some controversy as to whether or not Mary Shelley could be credited with writing this text, which I personally think is nonsense because every author uses editors. And I very much wonder if Mary Shelley was male, would the question even have come up as to whether or not she could claim authorship for this just because she used outside editorial advice. Now, probably Frankenstein is best known through popular culture, and that was cemented in the 1930s Universal Studio film version of Frankenstein, which is a very different story than what Mary Shelley originally wrote for a whole host of reasons that I'll talk about next class as well. The plot is different. The structure is different. Even the character names and the length are different as well. And what I've done in the notes below is not only have I included the text for Frankenstein, and of course I ordered it for the class, but if you don't have a copy of that or your own copy, you can access it online for free. But I've also included a link for the film, the 1931 James Whale Universal Studios film Frankenstein, which is an hour and 10 minutes, which I would like you to watch. So that's going to be your assignment at the ending of this. And you can access it through streaming services like Amazon Prime or YouTube. But I was also able to find a free link for it. And you can see that I've got that through archive.org. So you can click on that and watch that. And I am going to ask you to pay particular note to the opening credits, which is something that we will be discussing next class as well. So I don't ask you to watch this film in terms of understanding the text. I think of the film as a completely different story in many respects than what Mary Shelley wrote. But talking about the reasons why Hollywood did that, I think are quite fascinating and definitely related to the role of female in society. So my experience has been that while most people know about the iconic Universal Studio version of Frankenstein, the square head and the bolts and all of the rest, very few people have seen the movie. So I'm going to end it here for you to watch the movie, and the next class we can talk about both the movie as well as the text. I've also given you a link to our next text, which is going to be Persuasion, and of course I ordered that as a novel as well for us in class. What would be ideal, though I know that life isn't always ideal, but what would be ideal is that you finished reading Frankenstein at this point so that you can begin with Persuasion. So by the time we actually start talking about Persuasion next week, then you're ready for our next major text. So what's left is our discussion forum question, which would be due Saturday. That happens to be June 1st. And that said, if you need additional time, please let me know, and I'll be happy to grant it to you. and it's about the 1931 film Frankenstein. Did you like it or dislike it, and why? And again, there's no right or wrong answer. I'm more interested in your reasoning than I am in your response about liking or disliking. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about, well, Frankenstein. Take care. Bye bye, and enjoy the movie.